Hello, everyone. Welcome to the TopCyberPro podcast. I'm founder and CEO Jim West, and today I got a guest that's got a lot of titles. Like most of my guests, has a whole list, like a couple sentences of titles. But we're just going to start with the high level ones. He's a CISO, he's a author, speaker, cybersecurity leader, and more interestingly enough, and I'm sure we'll get to it, he is a former Secret Service agent. So we got a lot of stuff to cover and talk about. But without further ado, welcome to the TopCyberPro podcast. We have Richard, and then make sure I get the last name right, LaTulip.
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. So Richard, let's just dive right into the being a former Secret Service agent. I mean, going from Secret Service into cybersecurity, people when they think of Secret Service, they think of the guys that are protecting like the president and high level people in government and taking a bullet for them, right? But you actually did cybersecurity work and investigative work in cybersecurity as a Secret Service agent. What can you share about that? I know there might be things you can't talk about due to confidentiality reasons, but what are things that you can share about that? Because that seems like super amazing and awesome.
Yeah, so I guess, it's an interesting thing that you brought up, right? Because I do a lot of public speaking and I think I have that conversation where I start with my background. And, the first thing I say is 25 years in the US government, 23 with the United States Secret Service. And you're probably all wondering right now, why is a Secret Service guy in front of me? Because you may think of in the line of fire, as you mentioned it, right?
Mhm.
Protecting the president, doing a lot of different other things. But there are other aspects. For example, if you remember the beginning of that movie, Clint Eastwood, he was on a boat doing an undercover mission, and that undercover mission was for counterfeiting. And so you think of the origins of the United States Secret Service of where we came from, right? It came from President Lincoln at the time signing a bill, later assassinated that same day in Ford Theater, but he signed that bill that created the Department of Treasury, which standardized currency, the greenbacks, as most people in the
Mhm.
old days might refer to them as. And then it also the investigative arm, because there was something that was missing. And so protecting the financial infrastructure of the United States, that was our first mission. We only acquired protecting it later after several attempts of assassinations on current presidents and those that were actually coming up as candidates. But for myself, how did I get into cybersecurity and how did I get into that role? I think probably for me, it started when I was a very young agent. One thing that I noticed is most of the investigations that I was looking at, they actually always almost included a computer. And I also gravitated towards financial crimes. And so you start looking at the involvement of computers in financial crimes, you look at the progression. I knew that that was the future. And so I wanted to start to get my foot through the door. And a way to do that was to join a current program. So, how did I join the program, right? This is an interesting story. So, as a young agent, went to my boss's office, saw him sitting behind a computer. He was a very perplexed look on his face. I said, "Hey, you look to be pretty frustrated. Is there anything I can do to help you, or is there anything I can make your day easier?" And he said, pointing at his computer screen, using a couple of explicitives, and says, "I can't get this, blah 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 blah, bleep bleep, to print." And so I said, "Hey, well, if you don't mind, if I can step behind your computer, I think I can solve your problem." And he said, "By all means, you'd be a hero if you can do this." And so I stepped behind his computer. I installed a printer driver. I was identified as highly technical, and I was sent off to our computer forensic school. And so that was kind of how I got my start into cybersecurity. And it progressed through there very rapidly when you start looking at the Secret Service and the types of cases. Almost maybe I would have to say, not that it didn't persist. I joke on one of my presentations of how did the Secret Service or law enforcement in general miss the IRCs, the criminal forums? How did we miss that? And I argued it was an intelligence gap, for example. If you think about the day and age, I mean, I think about 1995 when I was at the University of Indiana and basically hearing people talk about going to the World Wide Web. We were going to move from intranets and we're going to go to the World Wide Web. And at the time, I sat there and go, huh, that's pretty interesting, right? Didn't really pay a lot of attention to it. I wasn't really into tech at the moment in time. But that's that time frame when you start looking at 95 up until 2000, where when the world became connected, internet relay channels, I said to earlier IRCs, but internet relay channels, those were ways in which people communicated. You had to be invited in it. There was rules that formulated around it. It was very challenging, but quickly that forum or that space or platform, if you will, ran into a challenge of I would even say marketing or communication to the wider world. And so that's what gave rise to these criminal forums. And one of the forums was underneath the case Operation Firewall. Operation Firewall was a scenario in which that was our entrance, meaning the Secret Service's entrance into the eyes wide open of how expansive criminal enterprises had become and the proliferation of credit card fraud. And so, if you think of skimming at the time, skimming was a way in which people were stealing credit cards. But ultimately, that put me front and center locally in my own case. Everyone between the FBI, US Postal Inspection Services, and anyone else that investigated computer crimes or computer fraud wanted to jump in because Congress was allocating a lot of money to it. Headlines were being made on a regular basis. TJX, Dave and Buster's, Walmart, the list goes on and on. You've got Heartland Payment Processing, and money was being allocated. The industry was up in arms of trying to solve the problem to reduce the amount of fraud. And so all the organizations started getting into cyber criminal activity. And this is kind of where prelude. I'll pause after this statement, but this is where it got me into it, working in an undercover capacity online with cyber criminals with the goal of taking the digital world into the physical world.
Wow. And with a career spanning 2 decades doing this kind of work, you mentioned, this, computer fraud and the laws had drastically were changing too, because I forget what the initial amount, there was like these thresholds where it became a felony or it was a computer fraud was a certain amount. I want to say like 5,000. And, and maybe at first some people think, well, that was, a significant amount of money. But in time, it quickly grew really, really fast, meaning, people were stealing, not just hundreds of thousands, but even millions and millions of dollars. So with that being said, I know we got a book there on the shelf behind you that kind of highlights. It's kind of written like from what I understand, to be like a thriller, and it would seem like something you would see a movie about it. Do you have a book that you could show us closer on the screen there? So it's called Operation Carter. Is that Chaos? And it's
Yes.
how one agent penetrated the underground economy. So could you tell us a little bit, like, what is this book? And it's based on a real case, correct? A real operation.
Yeah, so you mentioned a few things to set the story, right, or set the stage. If you think about cybercrime in the beginning, a lot of the laws that were used was wire fraud or say, for example, credit card fraud. And then the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was created and then codified with 18 United States Code 1030, which was computer fraud. And then, of course, you had all the different crimes. And so there was a variety of ways in which the government can go after these international organizations. And so when you look at my case and the things that we charged them with, it was mostly the 1029s, which is your access device fraud, and then also your wire fraud cases, right? So Operation Carter Chaos, that is a real story. It's a nonfiction true crime. I was the undercover agent. I was the individual who basically turned that digital, as I mentioned, right, the digital world into your physical world. And so, some people ask me the question of, well, how did that happen? And if you think about, at that time when I mentioned all these cases with all the different operational names, Operation Firewall was one of the most more let's say laced ones, but there were a lot of others that were popping up all over the place. And some of them make headlines and some of them don't, but they're all very significant, but they also shared something else in common. Mostly at the time, when I was doing it, it was a man behind or a woman behind a computer talking to someone somewhere in the world, trying to get the evidence that they needed to indict that person. I worked in the Southern District of California, and we had a unique U.S. Attorney's Office that demanded that they not indict people by the name of Fanu Lanu. Now, if anyone doesn't know what that means, it means first name unknown and last name unknown. So we needed to know, right, who was behind the keyboard. Look, if you think about it, other than you and I meeting and our faces being shown, I can use an image in front of me, especially with deep fakes, and I can claim to be anyone that I wanted to behind this keyboard. That doesn't mean that I'm actually that person behind the keyboard. We wanted to be able to say without a doubt that the person that we're indicting is that person that sat behind the keyboard. Nothing worse than arresting someone internationally, making them go through the identity hearings, making them go to, say, a jail or a facility internationally to wait extradition to the United States only to be found out that you're not the guy. That would
Mm,
be in my way, right? I don't want that to happen, so I wanted to be as sure as possible. And the way it turned out was I became that undercover agent, and then I became the person that was now tasked with being able to start those conversations and to be able to bridge the gap and formulate the idea of being able to meet with these cyber criminals in exotic locations, Bangkok, Macau, Phuket, Thailand, Antalya, Turkey, Dubai, and the United Arab Emirates. And so that's how these cases kind of evolved. But each one of them have a story, and Operation Carter Chaos really highlights a lot of those stories, but it doesn't just talk about the undercover operation in a romantic way. It talks about the nuances of being able to get there, right? The challenges that I faced, the roadblocks that were consistently put into my way, and the ways that I was able to overcome those and to keep the case moving in a positive direction and to have these positive outcomes, which meant the arrests of some of these very prolific cyber criminals. And one of these was celebrated. If you look over my shoulders, you'll see a poster. It was celebrated in a poster that was created by the U.S. Secret Service. And that poster really kind of exemplified the work that we did. And of course, I wasn't alone, right? I had a lot of support as well. But I had also a lot of internal challenges and plus the conflicts of living two lives, right? I had
mm,
my normal life that I was living on a day to day, known as Richard LaTulip. And then online, the online world where I went by the name of Surfrider, or if you got to know me, you knew my real name, which was Richard Druck. And being able to keep those two worlds separated, but at the same time running parallel, and being able to be that person who didn't make the mistake, right? Nothing worse than sitting at a bar having a conversation with someone and make a misstatement.
mm,
And I've had the challenges, right, where the bad guys challenged me to the face and said, "Hey, this is something you didn't say." I chronologize all those stories, the good ones. I don't have every operation. I don't have every little detail
mm.
because I didn't have the bandwidth to write 1,000-page book. I had to get it down to the best stories and the best things and be able to
Mm.
tell that story.
You're talking about. There's one aspect of everything of having like the little bit of digital forensics and the technical skills and know-how, but also it's really about it still goes down to like spycraft really. Behavior, being able to read people, being deceptive. And then keeping tabs on, like you said, that double persona where you have your regular life. And it's interesting where, like your real name in your other persona also was Richard. And it reminds me, my grandfather actually was a agent, special agent with Department of Treasury. He worked during the tail end of Prohibition, and he took down the equivalent of Al Capone in the Florida Panhandle. And there was a made-for-TV movie because this gentleman had a couple federal judges murdered. It was a big deal back then. But he talked about when he went undercover, and his name, of course, I'm Jim West the third. He was Jim West the first, but his undercover name was James, which is derivative of Jim, James Wesley instead of Jim West. So it's interesting how you kind of want it to be close to your name, so that way it's almost second nature. It's pretty cool how those things still stand the test of time. Him being back in like the 40s and 50s to to current day. What is it? What would you say if you could share like a snippet of book? I don't want you to share, like a whole chapter, a whole story, but what's a fun snippet that whether it's something that's absurd, out of the ordinary, or just a cool thing, a good what I call a nugget from the book that you could share with us?
Yeah, I guess let me start with the opening, right? So the opening, just so this is another aspect I think that'll be very interesting to most readers, right? The beginning of the book, almost you can argue the foreword is where I talk about certain aspects of preparation, and I talk about it within 2 pages. My preparation to start being an undercover agent probably began and ended with my academy. Yes, we had a conversation about being undercover and working undercover, but there was no formalized, say, 3 week or 4 week school in which I did undercover work. There was no playbook that I was given to do undercover work. Our policy was basically and again, this may be a slight exaggeration, it might not be, but from what I remember, it was no more than 5 pages long that accounted for the ability to do undercover work. And so we worked in a space where we were authorized to do undercover work. There wasn't many ground rules. My training was not more expensive than the basic academy training that I had. And so that was the tools that I had to go forward. So a lot of the things that I did in terms of trade crafts and or development of character was done just maybe out of seeing a movie or maybe out of just
Wow.
thinking that was the way I'm supposed to do it. And so the name of me or why I used Richard to begin with was because and you can see some of the photos that I have in my book, as you drank and hang out with these people, the worst thing you can do is have an alternate name that they start calling you by that you don't respond. I
Yeah.
always respond to Richard, and therefore that was my first name. I didn't want to be in a scenario where I'd be caught off on guard. Speaking of being caught off guard, right? A little nugget that I can say. It's the opening chapter. It's not the only one, but really kind of setting the stage of having online conversations. I spoke about being who you want to be online. But what else do we do when we're online? Do we tell the truth? Are we always honest with people? Do we
Hmm.
exaggerate? Do we
Yeah.
bring in other
Embellish.
right? So those embellishments are kind of interesting. And so I had a lot of different conversations with individuals online, and I had to remember all these different conversations the
Yeah.
best that I could. And I remember sitting in Dubai. It was late. You could see, I vision it in my mind. There were cans of empty beer, and there was a bottle of almost empty vodka that was on our table. And we were sitting out at this hotel and looking out at the Alberge into the Mediterranean. And so the sun is starting to maybe peak up and rise, if you will. And so we had become a little bit more friendly, and I felt a little bit more open of telling stories. Now, I never necessarily told the real stories, but I tried to intertwine something real with something fake. Example can be, maybe I have a brother, but we live in California as opposed to another location, or vice versa, whatever it is. But if I had a brother, I didn't make it up to be a sister. If my parents were divorced, and they weren't divorced, but the point being is I kept it a little bit to the real life, but I just changed nuances on the background of the story. And so now we're sitting there on this balcony overlooking, the Mediterranean, and I make a story. I tell him the story of how my brother just got into a motorcycle accident and he broke both of his hands and he broke both of his legs. Brutally honest story, right? Changed a little bit of the details, but not everything. And so I finished telling the story. I feel pretty good. We're bonding, building that rapport. And he looks at me and he says, "You told me you didn't have a brother." Now you can imagine being in that scenario where you're intoxicated. Now, seconds matter, by the way.
Hmm.
Now that I pause from that particular moment, right, you can sit there and say, okay, well, I'm setting up the rest of the story, but setting up the story in terms of a law enforcement officer working undercover and being challenged as to what your story is, being called out as basically you've lied to me online. And what do, right? The little hairs on the back of your necks may start to stand. You may get very nervous. You may start to fumble your story. You may try to retract. How do you recover at this point? Because you've been challenged on something that you've said in the past that he remembered and that you might not have
Hmm.
remembered. So literally on key. I was very, very proud of the moment later, but I didn't think about it at the moment. Maybe that was the benefit of everything that was going on. I just looked at him and said, of course, I lied to you. He sat back, kind of thought about it for a moment, realizing that, yes, I lie all the time online, and everyone does. And then I went on to say, the reason I lied to you was because I didn't know you. Why would I tell you anything about my real life or my real history or my where my
Sure.
parents or I was born? But now that we sit here and we're drinking vodka together, yeah, I'm letting you more into my life. That was the recovery that
Wow.
I needed. It was a believable story. It resonated with him, and we kept drinking and kept having a good time until the sun came up, and it was time to really kind of go like, "Hey, man, we've been up all night drinking. Let's reconvene at some point in the afternoon tomorrow." And so that was that story that kind of set the stage in terms of, and that was one story. There was a ton of other stories that are really good stories as well, in which I was challenged or I was put into a very, let's say, diminutive spot where I had to overcome the odds. Quick example, I won't go into the story, but gambling with people from Southeast Asia. One of the police officers who was in charge of the operation asked me if I was going to gamble, which I replied, yeah, of course I was going to gamble. And how much money was the next question? Well, the government only gave me $1,000. And as soon as I said that to him, he fell off his chair, screaming, "Don't do this! Don't gamble! Don't do it! They'll know you're a cop. They'll know you." And I'm like, "Look, I got it covered." And you can read the rest of the story of how it turned out. But
Yeah.
the point being is that was something that I was faced with. And when I talk about challenges within leadership, these were the type of challenges I'm talking about, is always being under resourced, always being let's say under allowed and things like this, and kind of really bring those stories to life in Operation Carter Chaos.
So, so folks, we're going to have the links to buy this book in the description below. So we're going to save you the Google search, but please get this book because I mean, just a few nuggets he shared already is just got me on the edge of my seat. Like I want to know more. And so, have you had any discussions with anyone about potentially turning this into a film or a film, maybe a limited series? Netflix is real big on true crime and cases and so forth. Is that something you can share that whether that these discussions have happened?
Yeah, I mean, right now, nothing, but the book just got released on December 23rd.
Oh,
I did
brand
have
new.
well, yeah, so it's brand new. So I did have a couple of conversations with, people before the book was published, and there seemed to be a little bit of interest, but with all things. Richard LaTulip is a very big name to me because I'm living the life, but to other people, it's about contacts, about who you know.
Hmm.
Some of the things I've said is everyone's got a great story, but can it make it to that silver screen or that series story, right?
Hmm.
So really, I think it's maybe my book gets into the right person's hands, or
Hmm.
through a friend of mine, I reach out through that person, and then they start to go, oh wow, there is not just smoke here. There's a fire, and
Yeah.
there is a great opportunity to turn this into a movie because, quite frankly, topics that are hot, right? The Secret Service, the challenges within the government,
Hmm.
the cyber aspect of the world, right? And the fact that if you think about what is the playbook in today's environment, what do most nations do before they do anything kinetically? They do cyber, right? They do a cyber attack on your critical infrastructure to take down your networks before they launched the kinetic warfare aspect. So cyber is the hottest topic. The criminal aspect of it is also a very hot topic.
Very hot.
The Secret Service in its own right is a very hot topic. And the fact that you get to see, it was funny because speaking to my brother in, say, maybe the year 2008, when I would tell him some of the stories that are in this book, the first thing he said is, you don't really have a platform because I don't think that anyone wants to believe that their government can be that incompetent.
Hmm.
And the reality is and today I think people have seen a lot of the blunders, they've seen a lot of the mistakes, and they've seen a lot of the challenges that people have to go through. And so this book, of course, brings that to light. And it also brings to get to light the good people within government that are always trying to do the right thing to make things happen with sometimes not the most resources you might desire.
Well, wonderful. And now we could talk for hours and hours about this book, but folks, he's given more than enough nuggets to appease the thirst. Get the book, order it, description. The link is in the description below. Get a copy. And more importantly, once you get the copy and you read it and you love it, please go back to Amazon or wherever you do purchase the book and leave a review so that other people can discover the work and get, just the excitement of reading a real life story. It's that, we got clandestine services and operations, undercover personas. It's got all the hallmarks of a great, riveting story. So get your copy today. Richard, I want to segue into what you do today. Again, I know we could talk everything about Secret Service Life, but I also want to talk about the great work you do as a security officer leader in cybersecurity. So, could you tell us a little bit about your day to day of your role today?
Yeah. So as a field CISO for Recorded Future, a lot that I do is mostly because if you think of the field CISO role, it's a little bit separate than a traditional CISO role. It really kind of talks to or brings to life the brand, and it brings to the forefront of a conversation, the value. And so if you think about the brand of Recorded Future, it's one of the premier cyber threat intelligence organizations that are out there. And so when you bring the value proposition, really what my role or responsibility is to tell a lot of great stories that I did in the past, not just about Operation Carter Chaos, but a wide variety of the aspects that I've done, but also to talk about, say, even my education, where I've gotten a master's degree in cybersecurity policy and governance from Boston College, right? So to bring all of that to bear, to be able to say, here are your policies that an organization may or may not have. Here are the tools that you may be using currently in your enterprise environment. Here is how intelligence not only supplements, but brings forward the true power of those tools. And here's examples that I can bring to life of variety of cyber criminals of how they take advantage of gaps within networks and leverage that to their advantage to penetrate those networks. And so, look, if we can focus on these different areas by using intelligence, we can be able to close those gaps. Something that I like to say, there's a couple of examples that I use, but I think one that has resonated well with people. I said, if you think about intelligence, you think about it in a variety of ways. Think of it this way. If I was to take everyone right now into a room, and if I was to turn off all the lights, and if I was to close all the doors, and if I was to blindfold everybody, and then I was going to randomly put up in the room, you don't know where it is per se at the moment in time, but I was going to put in the room, I'm going to put a bullseye on the board, and I'm going to hand everybody a dart. And then I'm going to tell everyone to throw the dart. Now, how many people are confident that they're going to get hit by a dart, right? Most people may feel that they're confident they're going to get hit by the dart. How many people feel confident they're going to hit the bullseye? And most people are going to, basically, I don't really feel confident. Now, you might hit the bullseye. There is luck, there is ways in which things work, and there are things in which you get from point A to point B, but we don't want to be lucky. We want to be consistent. So now add intelligence. That's turning the lights back on, opening the doors, removing the blindfolds. So now you know where your target is. And now how many people are confident that they have a chance of hitting that bullseye? When you add intelligence to the ways that you do things and the way you look at things, now you can be more strategic and pragmatic about your outcomes. It drives those outcomes. Now you're not going to still hit the bullseye every time, but if you can consistently always get close,
Yeah.
you're on a pathway for success versus the randomness of being successful, but not even being able to say, well, how did we be successful?
Well said. What makes Record Future is one of the top tier companies in this space, but what would you say is the distinguishing factor or the thing that makes them stand apart from their competitors?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say our origins, right? And the fact that we were not designed to be a cyber threat intelligence company. The goal of the company was actually completely different when it was created in 2009, but recognizing very quickly that we were gathering intelligence from all different resources and pulling it out from all over the globe, recognizing very quickly that what you have here is the beginnings of being able to show not just point in time, but also historically being able to understand tactics, techniques, and procedures, and being able to use that in such a way whereas now, as the company grows and progresses, and if you think about it today, right, with AI being involved and being able to leverage that, being able to say, okay, look, we've got all of this intelligence, not just from your open web sources, but from our private ways in which we collect intelligence, bringing that all together and then meeting these three factors, right? Making sure that it's relevant, it's actionable, and it's timely. If you miss any one of those factors, then really you don't have intelligence. You just could have a feed, you can have old news, start looking at that. And then now where we're currently at, and say, for example, we're currently at the ability to have and meet those requirements that we've set, but now adding AI, we go into our autonomous threat operations, where really once we integrate into your security stack, we've tailored it to your security stack, and now we use AI for continuous analysis. And we start looking at our intelligence graph. We start looking at the aspects of your adversary. We start bringing that to the forefront of, is it being acted on in the real world? Is it not being acted on in the real world? Real time, is this happening? Is it happening to peers who may have the similar technology that you have? Bringing those alerts through an AI automation, 24/7, 365. Those now become based on the criticality that you identify. are those that you need to respond to first. Because if you don't respond to those first, well, odds of compromise are greatly increased. So we want to be able to bring that because time matters. When I first started doing, let's just say, when I first started doing cybersecurity and started talking to people through our critical infrastructure program that we had in the U.S. government, we would talk at times in months. We would talk in times of, weeks. You had time to kind of look through your logs, to analyze the records, to understand the anomalies, to be able to respond, as say before exfiltration, and kick the bad guy out, so to speak. Now we're not measuring things any longer in weeks or months. We're talking days, we're talking hours in today's reality,
Mhm.
which makes the difference and making the difference of being able to say, yes, your SIM alerted on this particular threat, but we bolted on intelligence and now we can see the broader picture. And now we know it's more than critical. It's imperative that we actually respond to this and we do it now.
Awesome. Now, with a long career such as yours, I know that along your journey, you've had to have great managers, directors, executives, coworkers, colleagues, or just other professionals in the industry that you admired and looked up to that might have had a positive influence or what I say a positive impact on your career. So the goal of this question is to, would you like to shine a light on some of the names of those people that have had a positive impact on you and your career? Kind of
Yeah, I
like
think
getting
the
the
very
Oscar and you got to name all these people, and of course you're going to forget all the names. There's not enough time in the world to name all the folks, but is there a few that you'd like to pay homage to?
Yeah. I mean, there's probably three persons that I can pick off right off the bat. So the first boss of the office in San Diego, his name was Patrick Sullivan. I would have to say that a shout out to him and to the inspiration that he has given to me, and also shown a lot of just different leadership aspects and kind of helped to develop me to bring me forward. And then secondly, another individual from the U.S. Secret Service, Brian Nagel, was a person that I admired and I looked up to as well. He was the individual that actually had confidence in Operation Carter Chaos. He was the one that believed in its success, believed in my abilities, and without his support and or his blessing, I don't think Operation Chaos, Carter Chaos would have ever got off the ground. And then fast forward, and I think that developing because ultimately when we look at how we develop and how we continue, right? Most frameworks that we look at, most frameworks that we as security professionals subscribe to have a part where you continue to develop and you continue to educate and you continue to self-improve, right? Not just in the technology, but the people and also you as an individual. And so Kevin Powers, who led the program at Boston College, was another inspirational person. He actually wrote the foreword in my book, right? So another
Nice.
inspirational. And so those are the three that I can say right off the top of the bat who did give inspire and guidance and leadership to me, that I took a lot of the qualities that they exhibited and used those in my own career path, if you will.
It's wonderful. And these are just the people that, once they impact our lives, we're on a new trajectory, a new path. And I love that how it takes people, it takes, everyone to guide you along the way and, family, friends, everyone, and the power of people, right? I want to take a break from the technical cyber and IT question talk. This is my moment of levity. This is my favorite part usually with most of my guests because I'll ask you some rapid fire questions. There's no right or wrong answer, just the first answer pops in your head. So that's right out the gate. This one splits all the rooms of tech people. Star Wars or Star Trek?
So Star Trek.
Star Trek. Which cast or crew of the Star Trek?
So I mean, this is giving my age, but I'd have to say with Captain Kirk, right, and
Captain
Will
Kirk,
Shatner.
Shatner.
I grew up watching that series, and so yeah, funny enough, I look back at it now and I laugh because, you could see the strings that held the model Enterprise move across the TV. But I think that, the exploration aspect and I think I would even go to the second one that I watched was Battlestar Galactica. Those
Ooh.
two were the ones that I watched growing up quite often. And of course, then Star Wars came in,
Hmm.
so it is hard to pick one or the other.
Yeah.
I watched all three and even beyond, right?
Yeah.
So,
Of that original cast of the Shatner and Nimoy, who was your favorite character of that Star Trek crew?
well, I mean, I think who it was set to be, right? It was Captain Kirk, and I think as a
The
young
man.
person, the show, right? And so you look up to him, and I don't think I was at that point. Like some people are, I laugh at it. Some people are those scientist type that
Scotty
Spock was that.
or Spock. Yeah.
Body is the engineer. So I look at the scientific officer and I look at the engineer, right? I think you're mostly, but for me, I've always gravitated towards the leadership, and so, it was a natural fit to kind of look at that character and resonate. It resonates with you as a young man, or for me at that time, I was a young boy. I was probably watching more reruns at that point
All right.
than I was the development of them in real time.
All right. Here's the next one. Cake or pie?
So I would have to go with probably cake on that one, but
What kind of
pie
cake?
is second best, right? So,
What kind of cake?
I mean, really, anything chocolate based, I would go
Okay,
with.
chocolate. And so hot or cold chocolate cake?
Well, I'd probably go with the cold aspect of it, but in terms of a cookie coming right out of the oven, a chocolate chip cookie, I mean, yeah, it has to be hot.
All right. Now this one really depends on where you grew up and how you view it, but is a hot dog a sandwich?
No, it's not.
It's not. All right. All right. What was your most favorite book of all time that you've read? And what was the last book that you've read?
So this is always one of those ones. The last books, and then there's many of them, like the Twin Towers. I think is mostly when you start talking about those books and you start talking about, I think what or why. I want to say that up until that point, I had been reading a lot of World War One, World War Two, and Revolutionary War, and also Civil War books. And so kind of giving, the way to military history. And when 9/11 happened, I was really, let's say, caught into a situation where there's a region of this world which I really had no clue about. And I really wanted to get down to an understanding, at least a better understanding of, where does some of the conflict arise from, or why is it coming up and or boiling up to this point? Like what drove people to fly a couple of planes in not just into the World Trade Center, but obviously the Pentagon, and then one we don't know where it ultimately was going to crash, but it crashed in the middle of the field because some very brave people took action, and you think about it too, right? How did three planes actually hit their destination? And I think that, up until that point, they were never weaponized. They always landed somewhere. And, maybe there was some tragedy. I remember there being tragedy in certain ones where people, unfortunately lost their lives as passengers, but not an entire aircraft, not an entire building. It was one of those situations where, the people did something after they understood what was happening, and for the betterment. They, like I said, they all deserve to be heroes in that regard. But I wanted to understand, why did we get to that point? And so when you start reading those books and start to understand the history, the longstanding history, which the people that obviously do any studying of history probably will definitely understand better than I will, but you can go all the way back to the Crusades,
Mhm.
and you can look at the first Crusades up until, I want to say, it was either the fourth or the fifth Crusade, where that was deemed the misguided crusade that ended up going to, say, the northern part of Europe, and trying to convert a bunch of people. And funny enough, a place where I ended up living was Estonia. So Latvia, Estonia,
Mhm.
Lithuania, where that kind of crusade ended up going, and it went off the rails a little bit. But the point being is, that's how far back in history, and probably even further if you're a true, historian, if you will. But you start from there at least to gain a picture of where the turmoil started, where some of the issues began, and then of course you come up through where Russia was coming down, the Mujahideen was kind of fighting, and then, the beliefs of a lot of individuals of the insertion of Western culture into an area that they didn't want, right? They didn't want that culture, they didn't want that ideology, and the inherent battle there within, which kind of leads to that. And of course, were things that I wanted to understand, and so those were the books that I most recently read. And then I'd have to say that, another one which was very interesting, again going back to military history, was the Enemy at the Gates, which was the Battle of Stalingrad. And
Great
really
film,
when
by
you
the way. Yeah.
Okay, so hold your thoughts. I have a different opinion,
Okay.
right? So the enemy of the gates was really, if you think about Hitler in terms of just, North and South analogy, that was their Gettysburg, really. That was their
Hmm.
turning point, of the war where everything went south at that point from them. But going to your movie, right, where I was very excited to see the movie, when you start looking at General Paulus and you start looking at, right, the encirclement of his army and the eventual collapse of his army, I felt that the movie, and I get it, you only have 2 hours at max, maybe 2.5 hours. You boil it down to a sniper war, which I felt was really just a subcomponent of the overall battle. I would have rather have seen, the fighting in the streets and then the encirclement and the collapse of the left and the right flank of General Paulus and how they got encircled and eventually surrendered. And of course, leading to the downfall of the German or the Nazi army, right? So I would have rather seen that at the movie, right?
Hmm.
But it was or boiled down to a sniper battle,
Hmm.
and I don't think that did it justice.
Okay, fair. So, I know we could talk on and on about different things, and I want to just make a real quick comment. When you first said the Two Towers, I thought you was meaning Lord of the Rings Two Towers, so my apologies because I did a clap at the beginning. And of course, in the context of when you explained the books and the story, I obviously am not clapping for 9/11. So, I did in earnest thought you meant Lord of the Rings. So I wanted to make sure I say that because if anyone out there wants to cancel me, I corrected myself, put that out there, disclaimer. Um, a lot of us professionals are super busy with our day jobs. Obviously, being an author, a speaker, and a busy day job, and being a cyber leader that you are, a lot of us professionals do make time, whether we give of our time, energy, or money, to causes that are near and dear to our heart, whether it's volunteer work, charity work, a nonprofit organization. For example, I donate every year to St. Jude's Cancer Research Hospital and a couple other charities. So the goal of this question is: are there some causes and organizations that are doing some good, positive work in the world that you'd like to shine a light on the work that they do?
Yeah, I mean, ever since I was a young child, pets, especially dogs, have been a near and dear to my heart. And so some of those areas, I think it's ASPC, if I'm not mistaken, right? They're one of the organizations that's near and dear because of that. And then, of course, volunteer work, giving back to your community is always important. So I volunteered within my local community. I've done the member of the board for our homeowners association, trying to make obviously a better environment for everyone to live in, taking into account the variety of persons that come together in a particular neighborhood. And so those are a couple that I would give a shout out to.
All right. So 2026, right? We got a new year here. What's on the plate for your 2026? What are some of your big events? Are you working on another book? What are the big things you're looking forward to in your 2026?
Yep. So right now I'm working on part two to Operation Code Chaos, which I think it's a continuation of my story, which is really kind of going to change the narrative, and it's going to really highlight how things have changed in our government to a certain degree, how the hunter can become the hunted. And so it'll be a super interesting book, but it follows me as I've gone to Estonia, working at the U.S. Embassy there, and then ending up at headquarters on our cyber intelligence section. And so the stories there within continuing to chase the cyber criminal, but also fighting other internal battles. And I think that that book is going to really, really be a hit. I wish I would have gotten it done sooner, but with all things, it just takes time to write, it takes time to get it published, takes time to find a publisher, right? So all of those things. And so I hope I'm already on chapter 12. I hope to get it done within the next 3 to 4 months and
Well,
be
when
able to
you do
have that.
release it, please let me know. I would love to have you back to talk about that book when it's
Oh,
released. So you mentioned Estonia more than a few times in our conversation, and just to kind of give you the little tidbits and fun facts for some folks that might not know, Estonia is one of our top partners, our global partners, when it comes to like cyber war gaming and cyber threat intelligence and so forth. In fact, their country over I think 15 plus years ago had an initiative where they started teaching scripting and coding at grade school level, and they had I think it was about maybe 10 years ago those first few generation of classes went out into the workforce. So it was, and I believe we'll still see when we look back at it as a big economical shift into the cyberspace and technology because of all those students becoming, with the skill set of coding going into whatever career fields they go. So I don't know if there's been studies that have looked at that yet, or they will be, but it's really interesting that they made that part of the elementary and grade school education in Estonia. So kudos to them. But yeah, there's a lot of sharp folks that are out in that area. And in fact, Estonia, I think when you look at the top hackers and pen testers in the world, they're usually in the top 10. A lot of people always want to think of Russian hackers because that's what the 80s and a lot of the movies always kind of push that agenda. But Russia's not even in the top five. So I tell folks, hey, do some Google search and you're going to find out there's a lot of other countries that's in that top five list. But some other fun facts, getting back to Richard here, I saw on your profile that you speak a little bit of Russian and Spanish. So would you mind maybe sharing a couple of cool Russian quotes or sentences or sayings that you can share with us?
So my Russian has kind of deteriorated over time, but I'd have to say is I'd say one of the things that someone told me that you should say more often than not is spasiba, ya no hachu, right? So I don't want, because
I
they're going
don't.
to be selling you stuff, they're going to give you stuff, right? So I don't want it, right? So right, say that one. And then there's some very vulgar things that people told me. I won't repeat those here, right?
Okay.
And then for Spanish, it's mostly when I was kind of because I worked in U.S. Border Patrol as well. And
Hmm.
so I think with everything, it's time and distance, and it's always when people put you on the spot. But I would say, donde están los baños is always a good one to remember,
Where the
or
bathroom is.
deme, deme dos cervezas, por favor, or yo quiero más, right?
Mhm.
Those are always things, so those are some good phrases I think to remember, but it's always can be situational, and I almost need to get my mind in it
Of
before I
course, the
start to,
sense of the language in the head.
people speak it, and then I start, all the things come back to me in the words that and the words that you speak, and so it's
All
very
right.
interesting, but pretty
All right.
cool.
So my next question is the if someone's watching and listening right now and they're like, how can I get into like Secret Service, but I want to do the cyber stuff. I don't want to, I don't want to necessarily take a bullet for the president because, it does take a very, very certain caliber of person to be able to sacrifice their oneself to put themselves in harm's way for another person, right? But the fact that, a lot of people are probably, watching, listening, going, I didn't know I could do cybersecurity. Secret Service is an organization like any other. They have IT departments, they have HR departments. They're an organization with multiple departments and multiple layers and multiple missions and operations. But let's say someone's like, how can I work for the Secret Service and do IT cyber work? How do I get into like maybe someone wants to do more of the James Bond stuff, the super sexy sound and stuff like how do I do clandestine operations? What are some of the things that people can like read about? Is there a YouTube channel, website, or do they just go to the Secret Services site? Where can they get more information?
Yeah, I would say that would be what I first would say is obviously the website is the best resource. Recruiting events at universities, the Secret Service, they go there quite often as well. But ultimately, when I got hired, it was really two missions, but there was only one mission that mattered, and one mission that most people were recruited for. You'd find that persons like me in the minority. Most people wanted to be on the presidential detail or the vice presidential detail. And fair, that's what they are built for. That's what they are known
Hmm.
for. That's what the majority of the movies you see today, right,
Hmm.
are about. And so that's what attracts those individuals. But to your point, there are people out there that want to still serve and still want to be part of an organization that don't necessarily always want to do that. And I think the Secret Service, along with other agencies like the FBI and
Hmm.
it goes on there, they've created a lot of alternative careers for people that can still support the mission, but do other aspects within the mission. And the Secret Service is also part of that. And so there are, and I won't be able to tell you the job titles, I won't be able to tell you the things, but go to that website. There'll be educational material there. There'll be insights as well, and there'll be opportunities to apply. I don't know if they still push you to OPM, the Office of Personal Management, to do the application, but nonetheless, see what they have to offer, and then you can pivot to OPM, start your application there.
Well, folks, I'm gonna save you the Google search. I'm gonna put all the links for like Secret Service, FBI, even USAJobs.gov. I'll put it in the description below. And hey, take a chance, search. The answer is always no until you ask. I say this all the time. Until you ask, until you do a little bit of research and digging, you might not know. You might find the right thing, the right opportunity for you that could start and kick off a long and just very rewarding career. And it's not always just about money, but it's just about just the experiences and the growth and how you can just really feel utilized because, being able to serve a greater purpose, right? That's the most fulfilling thing in the world. Richard, we could talk forever, and I do want to respect your time that you've given me for the podcast today. For all my guests this season, this was not on the agenda, but for all my guests this season, I give them the final word. So whether you want to talk about your favorite dessert, your favorite color of the rainbow, whatever, it could be about politics, it could be about geopolitics, it could be about the color purple, whatever you want to talk about, the floor is yours.
No, look, I would say this is that, you mentioned it, the greater purpose of serving. I did 25 years in the US government. I encourage people to do something to serve, whether it's 5 years or 8 years in the military, to be able to, like to say, be part of something greater, to learn a little bit different. Traveling the world is an opportunity as well to experience different cultures in their location, right? I mean, the time that I spent in Estonia was super valuable because as an American only living in the United States, being having that opportunity, which I'm very thankful for, gave the expansion of the mind, if you will, the ability to understand and appreciate other cultures and other aspects. And then last but not least, go Indiana University.
Awesome. Well, Richard, thank you so much for being a guest on the Top Cyber Pro podcast.
Thank you.